And thank you also, Ariane, both for that very kind, generous introduction just now, but also for your kind invitation to me to be a part of this fascinating winter school on migration linguistics. As I was saying informally at the cocktails yesterday evening, I feel a little bit of a newcomer to a different discourse community. But since being invited by Ariane, I have begun to find it an absolutely fascinating topic. Unlike some of our other distinguished presenters we've been hearing from, I don't have too much completed research in the area of migration linguistics. So what I've tried to do is include research findings that I do have access to and ask you all to reflect on how and whether they relate to migration linguistics. That is my main purpose of presentation today. I plan to talk a bit like the previous presenter, Matteo, for about 45 minutes, and then we'll be very happy to take any questions and discussion. And of course, please put things in the chat as we go along, and we'll try and make sure that we get to any questions. I'm very conscious, it's happening a little bit yesterday with the freezing and hanging. If it happens, I apologize. Let's just hope it doesn't and that the connectivity remains good. I think that's it by way of introduction. So what do I plan to cover in the time available? Starting with what Ariane has shared, which is available on the Migration Linguistics website, in which he very usefully divides migration into 4 categories, namely labor, family, education, and forced migration. Rather boldly, with temerity indeed, I am using this presentation to suggest that while all these are certainly valid categories of migration with very important linguistic and socio-linguistic implications and connections, how about suggesting a 5th one, community migration? Individuals migrate, of course they do, families migrate, and or at the individual level, this is extremely important, but both historically and current day, whole communities may migrate as well. So for this, I'm attempting, again, rather bravely, to use the most relevant framework of language contact. Lisa and Umberto, Lim and Ansaldo 2016 would be a major source for this. Also, one on which they draw to some extent the notion of ecology of language, which goes right back to Einar Haugen in the 70s and indeed earlier. So, like I said, it's both historical and contemporary, but I'm certainly not a historian, although I find the history fascinating. So most of what I say will be contemporary, but we need a bit of history at some time. Now, because I want to tweak it to an area that I know a little bit about, I'm going to try and talk a bit about Borneo, which is where I am speaking to you from, Brunei and the island of Borneo. Don't worry, there's a map coming up. And yeah, about the origins of Austronesian languages. That's a little bit of the history about migrations, both by sea and overland. And yeah, as it says, case studies of community migration, particular focus on 2 groups, because there are a whole huge lot of ethnic groups across the whole of Borneo, as you'll see. Iban and Bidayu are the ones that I will focus on most, more on them in a few minutes. A few linguistic data examples, which mostly involve, as Ariane was referring to in his introduction just now, aspects of mixing languages, migrant and indigenous languages mixed up together, and arguably even forming new languages. So that is a very rough outline, and I hope and will try my best to keep to that. Whoops, don't jump too much. Where is Borneo? Many of you may very justifiably be asking. I hope this map answers the question. The arrow points to Borneo right in the middle. And I deliberately chose this one because it shows Japan up here, it shows the Philippines, it shows mainland Southeast Asia and Australia. So right in the heart of Southeast Asia would be one answer, which leads to the question, how come it has been relatively neglected in studies of Southeast Asian linguistics and sociolinguistics? But we're not going to go there. That would be a little bit negative. A bit more on Borneo coming up. Polities, it's divided up, 3 nations. Kalimantan, various branches or provinces, those are part of Indonesia, forming 70+% of the land area of Borneo. 2 states are part of Malaysia. The rest of Malaysia is across here, across the South China Sea. Sarawak, which I will be concentrating on, and Sabah. Equally interesting, but I don't know so much about Sabah. I should reveal at the moment that my dear wife is from Sarawak down here. So that's one of my reasons for focusing there. And you see just how small Brunei is. That tiny proportion of the whole of Borneo. But that's where I have the privilege of working and talking to you from now. So I hope that gives you a little bit of factual background. So back to this notion of community migration. All that I dare do is offer perhaps a working definition with the proviso, as it says, that it could be revised, both historical and contemporary, and the fact that groups of people, communities, are always moving. They have done for thousands of years, and this seems to be pretty important if we're going to study migration linguistics seriously, and this relates back to the map. We need to move away from what you might call stasis, static models that claim that these people speaking this language inhabit this geographical area, always have and always will. Here's a language map of Borneo, which is fascinating. I could take hours discussing this with you and lots of other people. Lots of people would challenge it. You see, it has names of ethnic groups, communities, and usually their language is the same name, it's synonymous. And you can maybe immediately see some patterns emerging. Look at the word Malays, 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 all around the coastal areas, right around the country, around the island, all the different policies, whereas there's a whole load of varieties and different languages through the interior of Borneo. I am going to suggest that maybe this isn't good enough, that this could be questioned because of the mobilities of communities. Okay, that this describes a static situation, which is not static at all. It may surprise you to know that Borneo has urban centers, like the capital of Brunei, Bandar Sri Begawan, the capital of Sarawak, I'm pointing towards it now, Kuching. I could have put in some pictures. Large towns in Indonesia, Banjarmasin, Balikpapan, where the oil industry is centered. Kota Kinabalu in Sabah, nearest to the southern Philippines. It has urban centers. It's not all rural and jungle by any means. They're busy chopping down all the forest anyway for timber exploitation. That's another story. Back to the Austronesian and the arguments about who migrated from where. This is contested. I will let you read, by just pausing for a few seconds, this quotation from my colleague, Stephen Druce at the University of Brunei, Darussalam here. He summarizes what is being called the out of Taiwan argument very nicely here. we must say as a rider that it's not the only argument. There are other arguments pointing out that the South China Sea, let me move on to the next one. Again, a map. All right, here's Borneo again. Historically, there was a land bridge, mainland Southeast Asia, the Malay Peninsula, Vietnam, over to Borneo, going back many thousands of years, which has led to alternative arguments. But again, we could spend fascinating hours studying where the arrows go. I've given the source for this, and very fascinating sources they are too. But see Taiwan, out of Taiwan, moving southwestwards. Austronesians amazingly move right across the Pacific as far as Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island, belongs to Chile in South America. And even equally incredibly, in the opposite direction, the main indigenous language of Madagascar, Malagash or Malagasy, is an Austronesian language. And if you didn't know this, say we could spend a long time talking historical Austronesian language debates and everything, and fascinating it is too, and plenty of better linguists than me do this. But yep, it's an amazing area of study. It has been claimed, and not many people argue against it, that expeditions from southern Borneo reached Madagascar. They may not have gone straight, they may have gone round the coasts and into the Middle East and East Africa before getting there. Let's not go there, all right? Okay. How did they get there? Those of you from the Philippines will certainly recognize this. The picture is borrowed from Palawan, southern Philippine island. I've given the source there. Double outrigger canoe. Austronesians were, and certainly still are, great sailors. Not only did they have the technology of building boats that could cross oceans like this, but they also had knowledge of the stars for navigation as well. So that helped them get across the Pacific. Again, that's another huge area, and that's a huge simplification, but it sort of tells the story in a few words. Coming back to Borneo, were the Austronesian people migrating out of Taiwan to the Philippines the first people there? Probably not. There were earlier groups, and evidence is from caves and cave paintings and archaeological evidence that you see in the two pictures here. The Nia caves in Sarawak, actually very near to Brunei. If the border was open, we could get there in about 3 hours from where I am. The left-hand picture is a picture of the Nia caves. I like it so much that I use it as my background, as you see. And the right-hand one, picture of a buffalo or horned animal, is from these caves in East Kalimantan, Indonesian name Lubang Jeriji Saleh. That's interesting. The evidence, and it's all been carbon dated, may go back 40,000 years, i.e. round about the same time that cave art was found in European caves in France and Spain and elsewhere, which is fascinating in itself. So there must have been pre-Austronesian. Some people call them Australoid and connect them with indigenous Australians. Fascinating history. Let's jump to the present though. Okay. What we have nowadays though, as a result of these migrations and people spreading through Borneo, is quite a lot of diversity. Remember the political map of Borneo just now. So we've got Kalimantan, the Indonesian parts. The 77 living languages is a rough estimate. The indigenous languages is actually measured in the ethnologue, which many people refer to. Likewise for Sabah and Sarawak, total number of living languages, total number of indigenous languages. Again, these are contestable. What's a language? What's a dialect? What does it count as to be a living language? But there's a lot of them, even in tiny Brunei. my students and I have counted up to 26 languages. Of course, that includes the languages of migrant workers, and there are quite a lot of those here, myself included. 7 indigenous languages, 3 more that are indigenous to Borneo, but not to the current territory of Brunei. So that explains that little note in parentheses there. So, yep, there's a lot of diversity of languages across Borneo. Just a little jump back into history now. In the colonial era, remember that Sabah and Sarawak were colonized by the British, arguably. Brunei was a British protectorate. Kalimantan and the rest of Indonesia were colonized by the Dutch. In those times, people were obsessed with naming and classifying languages. There's an incredible piece of work by a linguist called Sidney Ray, published in the Sarawak Museum back in 1913, so it's over 100 years ago, called The Languages of Borneo. Remarkable collection of data of very many languages, and a fascinating document you could study for your whole life, I think. But like I said, this idea of languages being stuck in one territory, leading to, as Ray did, the collection of word lists. And of course, I mustn't criticize the collection of word lists. Many people still do it. Many languages are undocumented. There's still a need for it. But there are critiques of it. And I could mention Benedict Anderson's Imagine Communities here. I could mention Peter Metcalf of Borneo, a US-based anthropologist, writing about Borneo and saying how all the names are creations and are really not fixed. And an ex-colleague in Brunei, Frank Fanzelo, from the anthropology side, discussed this as well. So there's plenty of critiques of this idea of languages being fixed and people being fixed in one place. Okay, so that's a little bit of my framework. I said I would talk a little bit more about Iban. I apologize for the quality of this map of part of Borneo. Basically, it's Western Borneo, but you can just about see the arrows here showing the direction of the Iban people's migration in historical time. Little bit about Iban. Historically and in the colonial discourse, they are the headhunters of Borneo. If you've heard anything about Borneo, you might have heard about headhunting. Again, I'm not going to go into it. I would reassure you that there's no headhunting going on now, but in the 19th and up to the early 20th century, certainly there was. Young men used to bring back heads as trophies to help them get a wife from the home village or longhouse. Iban itself is not even an endonym. It's given by other people. It's from the word Hivan in Kayan, who are another major central Borneo group. And it actually means people who migrate in Kayan. There's a source for that. Iban are the largest single ethnic group in Sarawak state. 30% of the total population of the Malaysian state of Sarawak. Doesn't actually give them very much political power, but we're not heading that way in that talk. That would be a less relevant issue. But we are going to talk about Iban migrations. And that's why I've put up this map. And there's the sources for that. And there is a reference list if anybody wants to follow it up. This is all still within Sarawak. The Iban actually continued migrating to the northwest. So these arrows went much further. They occupied previously unpopulated or maybe underpopulated valleys for shifting cultivation, growing rice, hill paddy, and also using the rivers for fishing, etc., and feeding themselves. And this started about 100 years ago, so that now in Brunei, remember that Iban are not native to Brunei, so they're all migrants over the past 100 years or so. About 20,000. Brunei's total population is only just over 450,000. So it's about 4.3% of Brunei's total population. So yes, they're a minority. Traditionally, Iban live in longhouses. Here's a picture of one. Usually the longhouse is constructed by a river so that they can get there by boat. The right-hand photo shows the traditional costume for celebrating using the rice wine. Philippines people in the group listening to this will find many affinities, I'm sure, especially those from southern Philippines. So we'll come back to Iban in a minute. The second group I want to study, as I intimated just now, Bidayu, because my wife happens to be a member of this much smaller community. They used to be called Land Dayak in the colonial times because they lived inland, whereas the Iban colonially were wrongly referred to as Sea Dayak because their boats went out to sea. 8% of Sarawak total population. The meaning of the word, like so many ethnic groups, communities across Borneo, just means people of the land. They are said both in their own traditions and historical memories, mostly oral history, of course, but supported by historical linguistic proto-language reconstruction to originate from a mountain that is across the current border in West Kalimantan. There's a map coming up. They migrated into what is now Sarawak and then got separated because that area is quite mountainous. Nowadays, unlike the Iban, which I'll come back to, Bidayu have at least 5 distinct varieties. Some people say they're up to 29 varieties. Are they dialects? Are they languages? Only the neighboring varieties have sufficiently high percentages of shared cognates. That's what PSC is. I probably should have explained that. You have to be talking to your neighboring group to be mutually intelligible. 2 groups away, they may have to switch to Malay or even English to make themselves understood. Plenty of sources for this. Right, here's another map. There's quite a lot of maps in this talk. I hope you find maps interesting. I do. So Mount Sungkong, supposed to be the origin of the Bidayu community, migrating along roughly these lines into 4 major and 1 smaller language group. And like I said, the neighboring ones may understand each other, but 2 groups away, like Baujagoy and Bukasadong, maybe have difficulty. Less mutually intelligible, below 50% shared cognates. So a little bit more on Bidayu. Consequences of migration, because our topic is migration linguistics. This meant contact with the Malay coastal communities. Malay people are largely seagoing. Agriculture, yes, but a lot of fishing. Therefore, they remain in the coastal areas. Remember the earlier map. In modern times, they have acquired both local Malay, i.e. Sarawak Malay, and also standardized Malay, because of course, Malay, Bahasa Melayu in Brunei, Bahasa Malaysia in Malaysia, are the official and national languages. These are additional to, or in many cases, have replaced the original indigenous Bidayu varieties. So if Bidayu people migrate to Kuching or Kuala Lumpur, their children may very well lose their ancestral heritage Bidayu variety. They even adopt Malay kinship terms. Now, kinship, names of family relatives, you'd think that would be the last thing, the thing that they would hold on to most of all. But they use Malay terms like kakak for elder sister, abang for elder brother, and adik for younger sibling, male or female. And the source for this is my good friend Yvonne Campbell. Despite the Western sounding name, she is actually Bidayu. If you want to see some variety, how the original 1 language historically has become, here are examples of 4, the word for moon, the word for star, the word for cloud, and the word for rain. Might take a bit long, seeing that time is flying, to talk you through all of these from a linguistic point of view. Again, I would love to know just how many of these are cognate with Philippines languages or with any other languages of Indonesia, let's say. There's plenty that we could say about pre-ploded nasals, buatan, bitaken, in Salako, which are retained but have been dropped in the other varieties. There's a study to be done in that, but that would get us into a little bit more heavy linguistics, perhaps. Here's another picture, probably time for another picture. Bidayu traditional dress. This is actually taken from a website telling a story of Bidayu people from Sarawak going back to their original place of habitation, Mount Sungkong, coming down some rather steep steps through what looks like a pepper garden there. So again, in traditional dress because it is a festival. And another consequence, which is of great interest to me, I've often used this slide before. I hope you find it interesting as I do. This is in a dinner program. It's quite a long time ago in the mid-90s, as you see. 4 languages, they're all color-coded. The Bidayu is in black, the English is in green, Malay is in blue, and is that it? 3 colors, sorry, I'm miscounting. 3 is enough, Bidayu, Malay, and English. Yeah, other things can have 4 languages actually, but that's on the same dinner program. Okay, so there's an amazingly large amount, even in public language use. Okay, the slogan, Bipokat Oto Maju, make us strong. That, of course, as a slogan or motto, is in the local Bidayu language, the Baujagoi Bidayu. Okay, so I love to collect things like that, just to show language mixing and language maintenance. I'll just pause here. I would argue that just because people mix like this doesn't mean that necessarily that the Bidayu is going out and going to be lost. Some people into ethno-linguistic vitality use the notion of mixing to show that the original language may be threatened. I would dispute that because Bidayu people can happily carry on speaking Bidayu and speak Malay and speak English. And I don't know, it's not necessarily problematic. And it's not problematic to mix them either. A few more examples. Here's one that Yvonne Campbell very cleverly collected from a home and family domain. Again, I don't think we got time to go through it, but if you see, maybe start on the right for the English translation, mother and son talking in the kitchen. Right, and again, the same color code, green for English, blue for Malay, a black for the local Bidayu. In this case, it's a sub-variety of Bao Bidayu, which is called Singai. So they're close sub-dialects, if you like, sub-varieties, as well as the basic 5. That's why some people divide it into 29. So if one had time, and Yvonne and I have done this to some extent and intend to do more, just what are the motivations for the switches at these points? And this is a point of endless fascination. And the fact that it involves 3 languages, not just 2, is very much a part of that fascination for me. Whoops, sorry, going the wrong way. Folk tales. We think that folk tales are about the most traditional things that you can find. Here's one. If you can see my screen, I'm holding up, no, I'm not. Yes, I am. Oh, can you see it? The Mouse, Deer and the Crocodile. University of Malaya told this folk tale, collected it in 111 languages. This is it in Singai Bao Bidayu. Again, the Malay words are in blue. So there's quite a few of them, even in this very short text. If you're wondering what it's all about, there it is in English. Mouse, deer and crocodiles. It's a very traditional tale, probably occurs all over Southeast Asia, wherever you've got mouse, deer and wherever you've got crocodiles. Just for comparison, the same folktale in Iban. And Iban, interestingly, has slightly more connection with Malay. Iban is closer to 60+% cognate with Malay, whereas the Bidayu varieties are generally under 50. That makes for a fascinating comparative study as well. So coming now, as I should, looking at the time, to serious matters. I said I would refer to ecology of language issues. So This is my question here. I wouldn't claim to have anything like a full answer to it, but it does seem to me an important question for establishing the notion or questioning the notion of community migration. So we can have an initial classification of what happens to people when they migrate. Iban would be an example of migrating and maintaining. I forgot to say earlier that there's very little geographical or dialectal variation. Basically, with a few minor exceptions, the Iban of Brunei speak the same Iban as the Iban of Kalimantan or anywhere else across the middle of Borneo. It's not much different. So let's call that migrate and maintain. Connected, maybe part of the same thing, migrate and conquer. Of course, the migrations weren't always peaceful. They used to beat each other up and, as we said, take each other's heads to grab territory, usually because of better farming land or more desirable territory for whatever reason. And normally worldwide, and this is where we bring in wider issues that other presenters have mentioned, conquered or enslaved groups would normally shift to the conquering group's language. There is one exception to this, actually, which I don't think anybody's explained, but there's one group, the Auhang, who conquered another called the Pin, historically in the 19th century, but actually adopted the conquered group's language. That seems very exceptional, but it is in the literature. I don't have an explanation for it. I haven't been to that bit of Borneo. Alternatively, and the Bidayu form an example for this, migrate and diversify, or migrate and shift, or migrate and develop your own variety because of geographical distance, because different river valleys are separated by mountains. And historically, there wouldn't be so much language contact. Other examples, which I haven't had time to include, but as you saw, there are many other ethnic groups and languages across Borneo, migrate and merge. One group migrates into another group's territory, they change their name, they change their language, and live together. And this is how new languages are developed, maybe in accordance with Mufweini's feature pool argument. Again, much work remains to be done on important topics like that. So my preliminary conclusions, and instead of putting it in brackets, I should have bolded it maybe, would be that the first one's a pretty obvious one, isn't it? Community migration. No one uses one language only today. Other people have referred to this as monolingual fallacy. It has come up in other people's presentations. I believe it's Robert Phillipson and Tova Skutnab Kangas who write about monolingual stupidity as a property of Americans, Brits, Australians, and people who are basically monolingual in English. It's a bit of a condemnation, but it does have some logic to it. But most likely, in view of the history of migrations, nobody ever did use just one language. People in Borneo would have at least had access to and needed to understand the language of their neighbors, even if they were fighting them. Okay, so the evidence that we have, and there's a whole load more, of course, I haven't had time to show, both in speech and writing, containing insertions with Malay, English, Chinese, and apologies. There's considerable Chinese population in all parts of Borneo, but because I'm not a Chinese speaker, I don't really feel qualified, but people do mix Chinese with the other indigenous Borneo Austronesian languages. It happens a lot. It certainly happens with Iban because historically, traditionally, you had the longhouse with about 20 or 25 families, and you had one Chinese trader who set up shop beside the longhouse. And that family certainly needed to speak Iban and may indeed have lost their Chinese if they were far upriver. Doesn't happen so much now because of better communication, roads, etc. make a big difference as opposed to having to go everywhere by river. Yeah, issues for me that remain, which you all may like to bring up in chat and questions, and you're welcome to. I don't necessarily have answers. I'm suggesting this is areas for further research. Community migrations that are still happening alongside, maybe interconnected with the 4 other categories that Ariane Bolongan has identified. That would be one thing. And yes, the interconnection of the categories and how best we can research the socio-linguistic effects of these migrations, some of which are internal, but some of which cross borders, as with the Iban moving into Brunei. So asking that same question again, is it? I hope somebody's going to tell me and comment on it. And that is pretty much what I want to say. If I was being a bit more trad and had a bit more preparation time, I would find a chant or a traditional song, which certainly exist in the Borneo indigenous languages about migrations. Instead, I found a couple of Western songs, Rai Kuda. There's the YouTube link. And the other one, of course, very well known, I'm sure, to all of you, is Bob Marley's Exodus. Okay, now, I don't guarantee that this is going to work. I've put up the lyrics first. Let's see if we can get this to work. Oh, there's Exodus. Can you hear that, people?
No.
Could you try pressing play, Dr. McLellan?
That would help. Yes, I'm getting it. Better?
Adjust the volume, I guess.
Sorry, is that not working?
Yeah.
Or maybe you haven't shared your sounds.
This is I'm a bit old and technically challenged, so that is why I put up the links. And of course, moving backwards, I'm very happy to share the slides, so that if you want to find it for yourself, and you know, it's perfectly adequate, and maybe given the time that it is, maybe just the lyrics might be enough. Yes, and we could stop on that. But there's a reference list. We won't. Wait a minute. I can't move it on now. Whoops.
Or maybe share the link on the chat box, and then we can share.
Yes, I could do that. I'm trying to stop sharing now. Okay, so this is my final slide. Ati Sija, terima kasih. Thank you very much. I welcome